Imagine fleeing a literal state-sponsored inquisition. Like you cross an ocean into completely unmapped territory just to escape being burned at the stake.
You're just seeking survival.
Exactly. Just survival. But then, within a few generations, your descendants establish this massive black market empire that fundamentally fuels the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, it's a staggering historical paradox.
It really is. And you were listening to a deep dive that completely shatters this sanitized, binary versions of colonial history we are so used to hearing. Today, we are tearing down the myth of the neat dividing line between conqueror and conquered. We're looking at a group operating entirely in the shadows, the Lançados.
The paradox of their existence really forces us to reevaluate how early global networks were actually built.
Right. And to unpack this, we have some incredible sources today.
Oh, we do. We are relying on some heavy-hitting scholarship. We're pulling extensively from Peter Mark's foundational book, The Forgotten Diaspora, alongside the UNESCO General History of Africa, Volume 5.
And we're diving into some brand new stuff too, right?
Yeah, we are bringing in very recent ongoing research from academic databases like SciSpace. This new research is currently mapping the enduring cultural and linguistic impact this group left on West Africa.
Which is super important for our focus today.
Yeah.
It is just a phenomenal stack of sources. But before we can understand what they did in West Africa, we really have to understand what they were fleeing in Europe.
You have to know the context.
Exactly. Take us back to the beginning. We are talking about 1536.
Right, 1536. That year marks the official establishment of the Inquisition in Portugal under King Manuel I and subsequently John III.
But it wasn't just a religious court, was it?
No, not at all. We have to understand the mechanics of this. It was a massive, highly efficient bureaucracy. It was designed for political control, absolute conformity, and crucially, asset seizure.
They wanted the money.
Oh, absolutely. The state basically weaponized Catholicism to systematically hunt down Sephardic Jews and new Christians.
And for you listening, it really helps to understand what a new Christian, or converso, actually was.
It's a key detail.
Right. The state gave Jewish populations an impossible ultimatum. Convert to Catholicism, leave the country without any of your wealth, or be executed.
It's a horrific choice. So obviously thousands converted.
But the state immediately treated those forced conversions as suspicious, didn't they?
Yeah, the paranoia was just baked into the system. The Inquisition operated as a pervasive surveillance state. Your neighbors were literally incentivized to monitor you.
Wow. So anyone could turn you in.
Exactly. If you were a converso and you declined a plate of pork, or if someone noticed you changed into clean linens on a Friday afternoon, which hinted at welcoming the Jewish Sabbath, you were reported.
That is terrifying.
It really is. The bureaucracy would arrest you, utilize torture to extract confessions, and confiscate your entire estate. Thousands were publicly burned at the stake in autos de fe.
It's like being trapped in a burning building. A desperate one-way exit strategy where you have to leap into a complete unknown just to avoid the flames.
That's exactly what it was. To survive, you have to find a blind spot the network hasn't mapped yet.
You have to leap completely off the grid.
What's fascinating here is how they identified that blind spot. A faction of these persecuted families realized that the edges of the expanding Portuguese Empire were actually highly porous.
So they ran for the edges.
Yeah, they fled across the Atlantic to the upper Guinea coast of West Africa. Those are the regions we now know as Senegambia, Cape Verde, and Guinea-Bissau.
Which brings us to the name. Because they didn't actually call themselves the Lançados, did they?
No, they didn't. The term was applied to them by the Portuguese Crown. Lançados literally translates to those who were thrown out or the cast out ones.
So it's an insult.
Very much an insult. It was a derogatory label for people that the empire considered traitors and outlaws, basically ejected by the flames of the Inquisition.
Okay, so arriving in West Africa is just step one. How does a group of European refugees survive in a completely unfamiliar, volatile frontier when their own empire still wants them dead or taxed?
Well, they realized immediately that the official Portuguese trading posts, the Fatorias, were death traps for them.
Right, because the Crown's agents are there.
Exactly. So they purposefully bypassed the European infrastructure entirely. To gain physical protection from both the Portuguese military and rival African groups, the Lançados integrated directly into local societies.
How did they do that?
By taking African wives, specifically women from influential ruling and merchant families.
Okay, let's unpack this. When we read about colonial-era alliances, it's easy to assume they were purely superficial, like a quick transactional alliance just for safety. Did this integration actually alter their cultural identity, or was it just a business arrangement?
The ongoing research makes it incredibly clear that it fundamentally rewired their society. By marrying into Wolof and Mandinka families, they didn't just get a business partner.
They got a whole network.
Exactly. They were absorbed into the complex kinship networks of the region, and this birthed an entirely new, highly influential demographic within a single generation, the filhos de terra.
The children of the land.
Yes, these were mixed-race, bilingual, Luso-African descendants who held immense power.
I mean, the vivid details from the sources are just amazing.
Yeah.
You have these individuals living in Portuguese-style rectangular houses with whitewashed walls, wearing tailored European clothes.
Right, projecting European status.
But yet, simultaneously, they are adopting local African scarification, speaking indigenous languages flawlessly, and participating in local religious customs.
They are a textbook case of a middleman minority, but on this massive scale. Because they possessed the cultural and linguistic fluency of both worlds, they were indispensable.
They could navigate both sides.
Exactly. They could sit in a whitewashed house and negotiate credit terms in fluent Portuguese with a ship captain, and then travel upriver and negotiate with a local king in his native language.
Fully within local diplomatic customs.
Yeah.
It makes me think of how an API works in software.
Oh, that's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, you have two completely different, incompatible operating systems. You have the European mercantilist economy and the African tribal trade networks. They cannot communicate with each other directly. So the filhos de terra became the essential translation layer, the API, that allowed these two massive systems to exchange data and, ultimately, wealth.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. And that translation layer is exactly what allowed them to build a staggering economy completely outside the gaze of the Portuguese crown.
Because early mercantilism dictated that all colonial trade had to be funneled through official state channels, right?
Exactly, heavily taxed and monopolized by the king. But the Lançados completely subverted that system. They bypassed the royal monopolies entirely and established themselves as the ultimate black market middlemen.
Because they had access to the interior river networks that the massive Portuguese galleons just couldn't navigate.
Precisely. They took small boats up the rivers, trading European manufactured goods, textiles, and iron for local resources like ivory, hides, wax, and spices.
But, and we have to look impartially at the historical record here, they traded in something else too.
Yes. They also became foundational brokers in the transatlantic slave trade.
Here's where it gets really interesting and incredibly dark. If you are listening, you really have to sit with this paradox for a moment.
That's a tough one to process.
It really is. We're talking about a demographic that was literally hunted. They were victims of a brutal, state-sponsored religious persecution. They fled for their lives, and yet, to secure their own survival and wealth on this new frontier, they actively participated in the commodification and enslavement of other human beings.
Yeah, the databases from SciSpace and the UNESCO volumes document this explicitly. We cannot separate their survival from their complicity in this dark economy.
But how did they actually function within that trade? The sources make it clear they weren't out raiding villages themselves, right?
No, they weren't. They were the brokers, utilizing that API function you mentioned. The local African elites, who are often their in-laws, were the ones capturing individuals during conflicts.
And the Lançados facilitated the sale.
Exactly. Living among them, the Lançados leveraged their literacy. They understood European contracts, they understood the credit systems of the Atlantic world, and they funneled these captive populations to Spanish, Dutch, and Portuguese ships anchored offshore.
And what's wild to me is that the Portuguese Crown actively hated the Lançados. The Inquisition wanted them burned. So why were Portuguese ship captains doing business with secret Jews who were smuggling goods out of the empire's grasp?
Because capitalism, even in its 16th century infancy, almost always supersedes ideology when the profit margins are high enough.
Money talks.
Right. The ship captains needed cargo, and the official Portuguese forts were terrible at penetrating the inland markets. The Lançados had the absolute best access to the interior.
So they just ignored the rules.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The ship captains essentially turned a blind eye to the religious status and the smuggling because the Lançados were simply too efficient to ignore.
And the immense wealth they generated from this human trafficking bought them the one thing they couldn't get in Europe: leverage.
Exactly.
And they used that leverage to buy religious freedom. Because if we look at the timeline, funneling all this wealth through local African alliances dramatically shifted their day-to-day reality on the ground.
It absolutely did. This leads to what historians consider a golden age for these Luso-African communities, specifically along Senegal's Petite Côte.
What changed for them there?
Well, by the early 1600s, towns like Joal and Porto-de-Ao evolved into major commercial hubs. The local Wolof kings recognized that the Lançados were bringing in massive amounts of European wealth and weapons.
So they struck a deal.
Yes. In exchange for keeping that trade flowing, the Wolf kings offered them ironclad, royal military protection.
And under that protection, the sources reveal something incredible. They weren't hiding their faith in secret cellars anymore. They were practicing Judaism openly on the West African coast.
Yeah. For the first time since 1536, the necessity of being a new Christian just vanished.
The specific practices mentioned are amazing. They built physical synagogues in these coastal towns. They observed kosher dietary laws. They openly kept the Sabbath, shutting down their highly lucrative black market operations every Friday at sundown.
They even brought in mohols to circumcise their sons, according to Jewish law.
It's wild. The visual of a thriving, open Sephardic Jewish community operating under the military umbrella of a West African Wolof king in the 17th century completely rewrites how we assume colonial power dynamics worked.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it demonstrates how mutual economic benefit can carve out pockets of extreme tolerance in an otherwise brutal era.
But it didn't last.
No, historical windows like this are fragile. They rely on a very specific balance of power, and by the mid-17th century, that balance collapsed.
The geopolitical landscape shifted, right?
Exactly. The Dutch and the French began aggressively pushing into the West African coast, heavily armed, directly challenging the trade monopolies the Lançados had spent a century building.
And simultaneously, the Portuguese Inquisition finally extended its bureaucratic arm further down the African coast. The surveillance network caught up.
The blind spot was finally mapped.
And what's fascinating is their reaction. When the pressure mounts, they don't retreat further inland into Africa. Many of the most prominent Lançado traders execute a final migration north, straight into Amsterdam.
Which makes perfect strategic sense.
Right, because 17th century Amsterdam was the heart of the Dutch Golden Age. The Dutch cared infinitely more about your global trade networks than your religious purity.
Exactly. So they integrated back into the global Sephardic diaspora in Amsterdam, taking their vast wealth and intricate knowledge of Atlantic trade mechanics, which subsequently helped fuel Dutch colonial expansion.
But wait, we have to address the people who didn't sail for Amsterdam. What about the filhos de terra, the Luso-Africans who stayed behind? Did the Lançados just disappear from West African history?
This is exactly where the most cutting-edge ongoing research is focused today. Their legacy is far from erased.
It's still there.
Very much so. Researchers utilizing databases like SciSpace are extensively documenting how this outcast group permanently rewired the social and linguistic fabric of modern-day Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau.
The ongoing research specifically isolates the language, right? The development of Crioulo.
Yes. The Crioulo languages spoken in those nations today are the direct linguistic descendants of the trade language forged by the Lançados.
So to go back to the API metaphor, Crioulo was the literal spoken code of that translation layer.
Exactly. And the mechanics of the language itself reflect that cultural blending brilliantly. The vocabulary is heavily derived from 15th and 16th century Portuguese.
But the structure is different.
Totally different. The syntax, the grammar, the underlying structure of how sentences are built is fundamentally West African, drawing heavily from Mandinka and Wolof.
Wow.
It began as a practical pidgin language for black market trade, but over generations of the filhos de terra intermarrying and establishing local roots, it evolved into a fully realized mother tongue. Today, it is the primary language of identity for millions of people.
And it goes beyond just language, too. The UNESCO sources detail how the architectural styles they developed, those whitewashed rectangular homes adapted for the African climate, became bedrock elements of the culture.
Yeah, that specific synthesis of European merchant law with African social customs became the foundation of Cape Verdean culture.
The ongoing study of this synthesis proves that the Lançados didn't just extract wealth and leave. They inadvertently seeded entirely new national identities.
They absolutely did.
So what does this all mean? When we pull back and look at the whole dark, triumphant, and tragic arc of the Lançados, we are forced to confront the messy reality of history.
It's never as simple as we want it to be.
Never. We started by looking at terrified victims, persecuted by an autocratic surveillance state, desperately leaping off the grid for survival. We watched them morph into ruthless black market brokers who fueled the horrific machinery of the slave trade.
Survival and exploitation walking hand in hand.
Exactly. And we saw them use that blood wealth to carve out a haven of religious freedom under the protection of African kings, ultimately leaving behind a linguistic and cultural legacy that thrives today.
It demands that we rethink where power actually originates. We are trained to assume that the architects of the modern world were monarchs sitting in European capitals, signing official decrees.
Right, the official narrative.
But the story of the Lançados proves that immense, world-altering power frequently resides in the margins. The networks that built the Atlantic world were heavily reliant on the ingenuity of refugees and outcasts operating entirely outside the law.
And that leaves you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. We dedicate so much academic energy to studying the official actions of massive empires, memorizing the treaties and the royal lineages.
The stuff in the textbooks.
Right. But given the enduring structural impact of the Lançados, their shaping of the Atlantic economy and their creation of entirely new cultures and languages, you have to wonder how much of our modern interconnected world was actually built not by the state-sanctioned empires, but by the desperate outcasts operating off the books, completely in the shadows. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.